Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to stay updated with our latest video. I respect Cliff's memory and everything he stood up for, and that's what I try to do too. Furthermore, Ray Burton is a really great guy. In the world of heavy metal, characterized by cigarette smoke, hard liquor, and guitars screaming with manic fury, one man stood out as the irreplaceable essence of the genre. He wasn't loud, he didn't party, and he never chased the glittering lights of the stage with his wild, untidy hair, flared jeans, a philosophy book, and a bass guitar that seemed to be fused to his body. That man was Cliff Burton. He came like a strange, blazing star and then disappeared at age 24, leaving behind a void in the hearts of Metallica fans that no one could ever fill. But what made this shy, nature-loving misfit become an unforgettable icon in rock history? What was behind that fierce, poetic bass sound he created? There is music so strong that it could stop the universe for a moment. Cliff Burton wasn't a star, he was a shockwave. His story, which was both beautiful and sad, is still told in every note, every tear, and in the hearts of people who used to think that rock music was more than just sound, it was a soul. Clifford Lee Burton was born on February 10, 1962, in Castro Valley, California. He grew up in a quiet town where the only sound he heard was the piano playing in the living room. He was raised in a middle-class family that loved books and the arts. Cliff didn't grow up with yelling or fighting. Instead, he grew up surrounded by classical symphonies, worn-out poetry books, and an expansive sky that allowed him to unleash his imagination. He was the youngest of 3 children, with an older brother named Scott and a sister named Connie. Everything seemed peaceful until the first tragedy happened. Scott died of a brain aneurysm when he was only 16 years old. Cliff was only 13 years old at the time, and the loss cut deeply into his sensitive, tender soul. There were no screams or rebellions, just a quiet boy holding his bass guitar and playing as if he were calling out his brother's name. That was the moment he promised himself, "I will become the best bassist to honor my brother." It wasn't a dream, it was a vow. Instead of chasing friends or sports like other kids, he would focus on this goal. Cliff practiced the bass for hours on end until his fingers hurt. He didn't just learn it, he lived it. Music was his refuge, it turned his pain into rhythm and let the unspeakable reverberate through the strings. Cliff loved classical literature and philosophy so much that he could read H.P. Lovecraft while listening to Bach and then switch to Black Sabbath without feeling the slightest bit confused. To him, the world wasn't split into beauty and darkness, they always lived together. Maybe that's why Cliff would go on to become one of the few metal musicians who could add poetry's melancholy and classical elegance to the thunderous power of his bass lines. Teachers described him as eccentric but brilliant. His friends jokingly called him an old soul, the kid who always carried a book and smiled softly distantly as if the world could never quite reach him. But there was one thing the world could never take from Cliff: his love for music and the silent vow he made to his brother. It was a small flame, quiet, unwavering, that burned inside a boy and would one day set the metal world on fire. Early career: as Cliff entered his teenage years while his peers chased popular music trends or youthful rebellion, he chose his own path, one that led straight into the core of music, where the deep resonant notes of the bass could tell an entire life story. He didn't learn to play bass to perform, it was his way of expressing, and from that point on every band Cliff joined was swept into a strange kind of energy, not loud, not explosive, but haunting and persistent, like a dream you can't wake up from. Cliff began playing with several local Bay Area bands, including Easy Street, where he played alongside Jim Martin, who would later become the guitarist for Faith No More. But it wasn't until he joined Trauma, a rising metal band, that Cliff started gaining recognition as a truly unique and standout bassist. With his long-hair denim jacket and a bass tone that sounded like it came from the depths of the earth, Cliff, James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich, 2 members of Metallica, were in the audience at a Trauma show in Los Angeles in 1982. They were worn out and disappointed until Cliff's bass roared through the venue. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, a bass solo using a WWA pedal that was distorted like a guitar but still rhythmically grounded and profoundly deep. Cliff didn't just play the bass, he turned it into the scream of a soul. James and Lars knew right away they had to get Cliff into Metallica, but Cliff wasn't in a hurry. He was happy in San Francisco with his family, friends, and the music scene he loved. At the time, Metallica was based in Los Angeles, which Cliff had called fake and soulless, so Cliff made an unthinkable demand: "I'll join if you move the whole band to the Bay Area." No one in Metallica saw that coming, but they agreed in the end, and that choice changed the band's destiny for good. Cliff officially joined Metallica at the end of 1982. Thereafter, the band wasn't just a number of young people playing Anglo-American heavy metal riffs. With Cliff, they added a new layer of introspection, philosophy, and art that made them stand out from other bands of the time. Cliff didn't say much, but every arrangement and songwriting suggestion he made the whole group rethink how they made music. Cliff Burton never tried to stand out, but in that noisy world, it was his quiet presence and the way he held his bass like a whispered prayer that did it. He had a great career at the time. When Cliff Burton joined Metallica, he didn't make any big statements or flashy moves. Instead, he quietly made a significant impact. At the time, the rest of the band was still moving ahead with the raw rebellious energy of punk and thrash. Cliff walked in like he was from another world. He brought with him traditional knowledge, the soul of a poet, and the ability to play the bass guitar like it was an extension of his own heart. Kill them. All of Metallica's albums that came out in 1983 were huge hits, but for Cliff, it was the first time he brought the bass out of the shadows and into the light. Painkillers for Cliff, Pulling Teeth, wasn't just a solo, it was an opening, a personal manifesto that said, "This is me, and this is how I tell stories." Other bands used bass as filler, but Cliff used WWA pedals. Distortion tapping turned the bass into a lead instrument, screaming and whispering in a way that was both wild and tender. At the time, no one else in metal dared to do that, and Cliff changed the way everyone saw the bass with just one track. But Cliff didn't just bring technique. With Ride the Lightning, 1984, he started shaping Metallica's musical identity through a deeply philosophical mind. Cliff didn't just play the guitar, he also thought of the chord structures, emotional arcs, and melodies for songs like Fade to Black, Creeping Death, and For Whom the Bell Tolls. These songs didn't just have heavy metal elements, they also had soul, especially For Whom the Bell Tolls, where the bass intro, which was often mistaken for guitar, rang out like a death nail, pulling listeners into a dark, endless world. This wasn't just creativity, it was instinct from someone who saw music as a spiritual way to express themselves. Cliff took ideas from Hemingway's writing about life, death, and war and turned them into dark, brooding melodies. At the time, no one else in metal was doing this. Cliff didn't just make Metallica's music better, he made it deeper, more layered, more painful, and more soulful. It was a silent but total transformation, like an underground stream soaking into the ground and changing the whole landscape above. Then came Master of Puppets in 1986, where Cliff reached the peak of his artistry and left his mark on what would be his last full album. It wasn't just Metallica's masterpiece, it was one of the greatest albums in metal history. Deep within its fury and darkness beat Cliff's heart, beating strongest in the instrumental Orion, a wordless piece that said more than any lyrics could, from the thunderous intro that sounded like stars colliding to the aching middle section where Cliff's bass LED like a lost soul searching for home. Orion was his musical will, as if he knew this would be his last chance to say everything that he couldn't say. If you want to know who Cliff was, all you have to do is listen to Orion. In every bass line, every pause, and every rumble, you can hear the pain, the solitude, the pride, and the desire to break free from an artist who never quite belonged in this world but left one of the deepest marks on it. While Metallica got closer to commercial success, they opened for Ozzy Osbourne and got great reviews. Surrounded by fans from all over Europe, Cliff's quiet personality didn't change. He wasn't concerned about fame or money backstage, he read tours with books. In his spare time, he wrote letters to his girlfriend by hand and went for walks by himself to enjoy nature. He appeared to view fame as a necessary sacrifice for creating music authentic to himself. That's what made Cliff Burton an irreplaceable artist, not just for Metallica but for a whole generation. He took metal from its roots in simple rebellion and led it into depth, philosophy, and music as a spiritual experience while everyone else was still screaming to be heard. Cliff Burton only appeared on 3 albums, but those 3 albums changed the role of the bass player in rock. When he was gone, the metal world shook, not just because they lost a band member but also because they lost a music icon who knew how to turn silence into the most haunting beauty in a personal life, even though he was in one of the most rebellious and high-energy metal bands of the time. Cliff Burton's personal life was very different from what most people think of when they think of a rock singer. He avoided flash and stayed away from the more glitzy parts of the music business. Cliff was in a serious relationship with Karen Lynn, who was his girlfriend during Metallica's rise to fame. People who knew him well said that their relationship was stable and calm. Cliff wasn't into big, showy displays of love, but he always cared for his partner in a quiet, thoughtful way. After Cliff died, Karen kept her feelings about him mostly to herself, but everyone knows she was heartbroken and never really got over the loss. Cliff's family kept in touch with her and considered her to be an important part of his memory. Friends and fellow Metallica members knew him to be honest and grounded. James Hetfield once called him the band's moral compass, someone who wasn't afraid to speak out when something went against his values. Although Cliff wasn't confrontational, he had clear personal boundaries. He didn't like going to parties and avoided the self-destructive lifestyles that many rock musicians of the time did. He also avoided anything fake or superficial instead of going to backstage parties. Cliff liked to read a lot in his spare time. His friends knew that he loved classical literature, philosophy, and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Cliff's style also showed that he was loyal to himself, while other band members started changing how they looked to fit what the audience wanted. Cliff wore flared jeans, flannel shirts, messy hair, and old Converse sneakers. He never tried to fit in and didn't care if that made him stand out. Cliff didn't have many close friends, but those who did know him deeply respected him. He wasn't easy to get close to, but once he did, Cliff was honest and sincere. Everyone who worked with him agreed on one thing: he put music and personal integrity above all else, and he stuck to that until the very end. On September 7, 1986, Metallica was in the middle of their Damage Inc.'s tour. The band was on a European tour to promote Master of Puppets, which was the peak of their career at the time. After playing in Stockholm, Sweden, they took an overnight bus to Copenhagen, Denmark. It was very cold, the roads were slippery, and there was thick fog around 6 a.m. Tragically, the tour bus went off the road and flipped over on its side in a desolate field near the town of Lundby. When the band members woke up from the crash, most of them had only minor injuries, but Cliff Burton wasn't inside the bus. To their horror, they saw that he had been thrown through a window and pinned under the bus. Some members, like James Hetfield, ran around the scene trying to figure out what had happened and calling for help, but it was too late. Cliff died instantly at the age of 24. It was heartbreaking that Cliff ended up in that bunk because of a simple draw the night before. Every night, Metallica members would draw cards to see who would get which bunk. That night, Cliff drew the winning card and switched places with Kirk Hammett, who had been originally assigned to that spot. No one could have known that such a small decision would have such a terrible result. At first, the bus driver said that the vehicle had skidded on black ice, but Swedish police found no clear signs of ice at the scene. Later, reports spread that the driver may have passed out or lost control, but no one was ever charged for what happened to the band and their fans. What caused it didn't matter as much as the unbearable sadness of losing someone so young who was seen as the musical soul of Metallica. Cliff's death shocked not only the band but also the whole metal community around the world. Many people couldn't believe that Cliff, who lived with clarity, moderation and didn't seem to be affected by the usual rockstar problems, could die in such a normal accident. It seemed unfair, cruel, and brutally abrupt that such a promising artist's journey was cut short just as it was starting to bloom. After Cliff's death, Metallica thought about breaking up, but after weeks of grief, they decided to keep going without replacing him but to remember him. James Hetfield, Lars Ulrich, and the other members of Metallica have said that from that point on, Cliff's influence could be felt in every aspect of the band, from the way they thought about music and how seriously they wrote songs to how they lived their lives and dealt with fame. Cliff's funeral took place in California on October 7, 1986. His body was cremated, and his ashes were spread in a private area near his home. During the service, Orion, the instrument he helped shape so deeply, was played as a haunting, wordless goodbye. History and power. Cliff Burton was on only 3 Metallica albums, but he had a huge impact on the genre. He brought an entirely different approach, with masterful technique, classical musical thinking, and most importantly, the ability to convey deep emotion through the bass. Metal bands of that era typically relied on bassists to primarily provide a solid foundation for the rhythm section, rarely taking the lead. Cliff, on the other hand, turned the bass into a tool of personality, boundless creativity, and even emotional leadership. Tracks like Anesthesia, Pulling Teeth, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and Orion didn't just show off his technical skills. They showed with brilliance that bass could be a main voice in the structure of a song. Cliff had an impact on more than just music. He changed the way future metal musicians saw their own jobs. David Ellerson's Mega Death and Steve Dorgo's Death are just a few of the well-known bassists. Robert Trujillo would later replace Cliff in Metallica. Testament has said that Cliff had a big impact on them, not just for the way he played but also for the spirit of freedom, honesty, and creativity that he had. Even after he died, Cliff's legacy continued to inspire Metallica. The 1988 album, And Justice for All, had the song, To Live Is to Die, on it as a tribute to him. The song has a spoken word section based on a poem Cliff had written that was quoted in the album's booklet. Although the album's bass was famously mixed too low, which caused a lot of controversy, many people think this was meant to represent the void Cliff had left behind, a presence that was too great to replace. In an industry full of temptation, Cliff chose to stay true to his beliefs and never change himself to fit what other people thought of him. That's why Cliff Burton is remembered not only as a legendary rock star but also as a real artist who stood for something more. Cliff and the other original members of Metallica received honors in 2009 during their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. His parents, Ray and Jan Burton, accepted the award on his behalf in a short but emotional speech. Ray said that Cliff loved music so much that it was his life, and I think he's still playing somewhere. Those words will always be true. Cliff Burton's legacy isn't what he owned or what he did during his lifetime. It's how his music continues to affect and inspire thousands of young musicians. He is known not because he tried to be great but because he was. The Cliff Burton was never really gone. Cliff Burton died when he was only 24 years old, but what he left behind didn't end with his funeral. His name lives on today, not only in the memories of Metallica fans but also as a cultural icon in the metal community. He exemplifies the longevity of staying true to music and oneself. No one maintained that flame more faithfully and warmly than Cliff's father, Ray Burton. For many years after Cliff's death, Ray continued to attend music events, fan gatherings, and memorials, always ready to talk to anyone who loved his son, even when he was old. He traveled alone, shook hands with fans, and talked about Cliff with a calm voice tinged with pride without bragging to fans. Ray wasn't just the father of a hero, he was also Cliff's spirit guide, keeping his character alive in the most honest and humble way possible in 2018. Alan County, California, where Cliff was born, made February 10 his official birthday, Cliff Burton Day. There were no fireworks or big stages to mark the occasion. Instead, fans from all over the world shared old songs, memories, photos, and most of all, their gratitude for an artist who lived and created on his terms without compromising. That same year, Cliff's family teamed up with Castro Valley High School to create the Cliff Burton Music Scholarship to help students who are passionate about the arts but are having trouble paying for it. For the scholarship, you didn't need to have perfect grades or be very talented, all you needed was real passion, which was what Cliff lived for most of all. In addition to public tributes, Cliff Burton's fan community keeps growing around the world with tribute videos. On music forums every year on his birthday and the day he died, hundreds of touching notes and covers of his songs are shared. People still think of Cliff as an artist who could never really be replaced, even though Metallica had a lot of success with other members of the band. When Metallica plays big shows, they never forget his name. Lars Ulrich and James Hetfield talk a lot about Cliff pay tribute and sometimes make Orion a sacred right. While there isn't a statue or monument in his honor, the music he left behind is more powerful than any statue. Cliff's death was not only a personal loss for Metallica but also a loss for a whole generation of artists who thought it was possible to live a true life, make art without compromising, and leave a mark without ever going off the beaten road. Cliff Burton never tried to become famous, didn't want to be in the spotlight, didn't change to fit in with the crowd, and didn't live for applause. But it was his simplicity, his unwavering belief in being true to himself, that made him immortal in a music world that thrives on noise. In a business dominated by glitz and glamour, Cliff opted for depth, and despite the band's rapid success, he maintained a quiet space where art could flourish in its purest form. He was with Metallica for only 3 years and 3 albums, a short chapter, but his presence was enough to change the course of an entire genre, and his low resonant notes will continue to echo not only in music but also in how future generations understand what really matters. Authenticity, pride, and an identity that can't be replaced. Cliff Burton did not die at 24, he just stopped there. His music, his values, and his quiet but lasting inspiration live on in the minds of millions of music lovers. What thoughts do you have about Cliff Burton, a quiet artist with a profound influence? What about his short but profound life moves you, makes you think, or speaks to you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you think this story should be heard by more people, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Let's honor those who lived and burned brightly, even if only for a moment, but left behind a light that never goes out.